He found her in a blanket swinging cold. K-13 burned raw. The wind ticked bottles. 1, 2, 3. He cracked the door, poured the second cup, and chose mercy with a rifle close by. Justice rides late out here. If you think it never arrives, saddle up and test that belief. Out here, folks die of silence more than lead. Hank Crowley rode with his collar up and his mouth a thin line against the north wind. The creek beside him had gone to glass a month ago. A dull ribbon of ice with snow drifted over it like flour. His gelding blew steam at every step. Leather creaked. The world was white and blue and mean. He wasn't hunting trouble, he was counting fence posts, thinking about hay he still owed Ephraim for. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Thinking about the day his wife took sick and he chose the herd instead of her hand. That kind of thought rides with a man in winter. It keeps close. The cottonwood stood alone on the bend, bark pale as bone. Something hung from a low limb. Not a snare, not a feed sack. A rolled wool blanket, gray and stiff with frost, tied sloppy with rawhide. It swung a little, lazy in the wind, then steadied like it was listening. You see odd things on the range? The smart thing is to keep riding. Hank reined in anyway. He studied the ground first. No fresh snow inside the wind shadow, a few scuffed tracks old as yesterday, pitch crumbs dark against the white. The air smelled of iron and pine. He eased down, boots crunching, his fingers cracked and salted from rope work, tested the knot. Not tight, not careful. He set the blanket on the snow, weight light as a sack of oats, and yet not. The roll shifted, a breath whispered out from inside, ragged, human. He opened it slow. A young woman stared back through lashes crusted with ice. Skin wind-burned and dry, lips split. Her right wrist bore a mark burnt in angry and red. K-13, blocky and mean, the edges salved with something that smelled like pitch. She didn't pull away. She didn't beg. She looked past him like folks do when the world has already turned its back. Just make it quick, she rasped. Hank froze. The wind pushed at his hat brim and hissed through the cottonwood twigs. He could have said a lot. He didn't. After a beat, he shook his head. Nothing's quick out here but the wind, he said, voice rough from cold. He backed his hands away where she could see them. I ain't touchin' skin, you hear me? Her eyes flicked to his hands, then to the sky. The blanket trembled once, then went still. Far off, the wind carried a thin sound. Glass on wood. One clink, a pause, a second, then a third, duller, as if from a shack with its door half open. Hank lifted his head toward the powder draw and listened. The sound died into the snow hush. Maybe it was nothing. Out here, nothing keeps a ledger. He slid the whole blanket, her and all, onto his sled. No lifting, no grasping. He laid a folded coat by her shoulder without letting it touch. He set a canteen near her chin and turned the cap loose so she could work it herself. Got a stove at home, he said, mostly to the horse. Soup, too. She watched him like a skittish colt watches a halter, ready to bolt, nowhere to go. Hank tied off the sled rope to the horn and stepped back, letting distance be the first blanket. He took one last look at the cottonwood and the quiet tracks, feathered with blown snow. He noted the crumbs of pitch again, the rawhides cut ends, the way the knot had been hurried. All of it went into that ledger men keep without paper. Name? He almost asked. The word reached his teeth and stopped there. A name was something a person took back for themselves. Winter had taught him that much. He swung up, turned the gelding toward home, and clucked him on. The sled jerked, then slid smooth. Behind, the cottonwood went small against the sky. He didn't ask her anything. He brought her home. The ranch crouched low against the wind, boards silvered by years of sun and snow. Hank swung down stiff-legged, led the gelding into the lean-to, and forked a mouth of hay. The horse nosed his coat pocket anyway, hunting oats that weren't there. Later, Hank said, breath clouded between them, then drifted off. He dragged the sled to the porch and shouldered the door with a hip. The room met him the way it always did. Cold first, then the sour of old coffee, wet wool, iron. He set the blanket bundle on a braided rug worn thin to thread and went for kindling. Hands moved without thinking. Paper, twist, sliver, split pine, match. The stove took it, coughed, then drew. Soon the pipe pinged as it warmed, and a thin line of heat began to push at the frost along the window. He kept the blanket whole, no exposure, no reach. On the table, he laid tools where a person could see them, pliers, a clean towel, the canteen with the cap loosened, a tin cup set near the stove's skirt. He backed off a step before he spoke. "Soup'll be ready when the bones remember what they're for." Her eyes flicked to the door, then to his hands. He took the hint. He crossed to the hook and hung his coat slow. He left the door latched but not tight. A hair of daylight showing, a door open without a hand. Wind hummed in that crack like a quiet promise. There's always out. The kettle went on. When it hissed, she flinched and pulled the blanket up by her chin with both fists. Hank pretended to fuss with the damper. He turned his shoulder to give her cover. After a time, the canteen scraped against enamel. Her doing, not his. Water went down in small, careful swallows. He never looked straight. He watched her in the black shine of the stove instead, the way men watch colts, off angle, harmless. Boots crunched on the porch. A knuckle rapped twice, then the door opened before he could answer. Maud Whitcomb blew in, all scarf and frost and opinion, 70 if a day, spine like a barrel stave, eyes mean to foolishness, but soft to hurt. She set a crock and a bundle on the table, pushed back her hood, and sniffed. "Smells like bones and stubborn," she said. Her gaze found the bundle of gray wool near the stove. "Lord help us, Hank Crowley, you got yourself a winter you didn't order." "Found her hanging in a tree," he said. Maud's face did a hard thing and smoothed. She didn't go near. She put the crock by the pliers, thumped the bundle of sheep tallow and sage beside it. "Leave the door how it is," she said. "Open without a hand. If she wants to run, she runs. If she stays, it's hers." Maud spoke sideways to the blanket, voice low as quilt talk. "Honey, nobody's putting hands on you in this house. Not unless you ask for bandage or bread. You hear the difference." The blanket didn't answer. It didn't have to. Hank ladled soup, thin but honest, marrow and salt, and set it on the floor where she could reach, if she wanted. He laid a spoon and stepped back until his belt touched the table. After a while, the spoon clicked once, twice. Steam fogged the air in front of her face. It smelled like life. Maud opened her bundle and mixed tallow and crushed sage with a wooden stick. "For burns," she murmured, not looking at the mark on the girl's wrist but not pretending it wasn't there. "Takes the edge off the sting. Past ain't erased. Past can quit hollerin' so loud." When evening pressed its nose to the windows, Hank fed the stove again. He unrolled a bedroll on the far side of the room and laid his own pillow there, leaving the bunk empty as a church pew. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Maud saw it and gave him a single nod that said a lot. The girl shifted. A pale hand slipped free of wool. It hovered over the pliers, trembled, then settled. The wire around her wrist gave a tiny, ugly whine as she worked it. Hank kept his eyes on a cracked plate on the wall and counted breaths. Metal kissed metal. A loop fell. She wound the cut wire into a small, tight coil, set it on the table like a coin paid on a debt, and drew the blanket back over herself. Hank said only, "Good." The stove popped. Snow slid from the eaves with a heavy thud that shook a pan. The girl startled hard, then made herself still again. Maud looked at the door and then at Hank. "You keep that crack," she said. A person sleeps better knowing light knows the way in." "I'll keep it," he said. Maud packed up what she hadn't used and pulled her scarf. At the door, she paused. "You listen for tracks in the wind. Boys that carve letters don't step light." "Pitch on the binding," Hank said, finally letting himself look at the cut rawhide ends. Dark crumbs clung to the grain like pepper. He pinched one, rolled it, smelled pine and tar. "They were hurrying." "Then don't," Maud said, and was gone in a rush of cold. Night took the place. The roof talked. The iron glowed dull, then brighter, then dull again. Hank lay awake on the floorboards, hat over his eyes, hearing the small sounds. Spoon, breath, the faint scrape of blanket when she turned toward the door and set her back to the room. He didn't ask her name. He kept the fire and the distance. Morning came in slow blue light. Frost feathered the inside of the windows where the fire had dozed and lost. Hank knocked the stove, fed it pine, and watched flame climb like a tired cat finding its place. He set out 2 tin cups without thinking, the first where his hand always reached, the second a little nearer the stove's skirt, where heat softened metal and nerves both. He moved through chores, the way a man does who's been alone a long time, quiet, steady, no wasted steps. Coffee boiled bitter and black. He poured his and left the pot where the steam would drift toward the blanket bundle. He buttered a heel of bread with mutton tallow and sprinkled a little salt. The room smelled of wool, bone soup gone to jelly, and sage Maud had bruised with her spoon. The door stayed as he'd left it, latched but loose, open without a hand. Wind worried that crack. The sound said choice. He let it talk. When the kettle hissed, she flinched again, but not as hard as last night. A pale wrist slid free. The brand was ugly as a curse. K13, skin angry around it, salve shining in the seams. Her fingers hovered over the second cup like they were waiting to be bit. Then they closed. She brought it to her lips in little sips, the cup shaking a little, and set it down as if it might break the floor. Hank took his coffee to the far wall and studied the crack in the plate that he used for thinking. "Cold's lifting," he said to the nothing of the room. "Snow'll crust by noon." She stirred under the blanket. The wool rasped at the boards. After a time, he caught her reflection again in the stove's black shine. Eyes not on him, but on the door, then the table, then the pliers she'd already used and left in a neat line with the coil of cut wire. She seemed to count them like stones in a pocket. He shrugged into his coat and went to the barn for the morning round. The gelding nickered, pushing at his shoulder for grain. Hank forked hay, checked water, broke the ice with a boot heel where it was skinned over. Leather thongs on the harness were stiff as bark. He warmed them with his palm until they bent. On his way back, he paused at the threshold and looked without looking, just a sweep of eye that took the room's measure. The blanket had shifted closer to the stove, inch by inch, like a tide. The second cup sat nearer empty. He kept to his day. He split a cord, the axe biting in clean. He stacked wood where she could see the pile grow, proof that heat didn't depend on luck. He greased the hinges on the front latch and then left them alone, the door still a little open. He took a rag to the Winchester and laid it on pegs low on the wall, not high where only his reach could find it. If a small hand needed it, a small hand could. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Back inside, the blanket rose and fell steady. A narrow hand slid out again, not for the gun, not for the door, but for a strip of cloth she worked from the hem. Slow, stubborn, she twisted her hair and tied it back with that strip, fingers learning their own head again. Then she pushed herself up on an elbow and studied the latch like it was a puzzle with teeth. "Latch sticks," Hank said, still looking at the plate. "Push it first, then lift." The blanket rustled, the latch clicked, the door eased a finger's width wider, winter whispering brighter, then eased shut the same finger's width. Once, twice, 3 times, the little drill of a woman teaching her blood that doors can move and not bark. She spoke without looking. The voice was sanded down, but clearer than last night. "You didn't ask my name." Hank let the words sit a spell. He set the spoon down and wiped his hands on his pants. "A name," he said, "is something you take back, not a thing I take from you." Silence held like fresh ice. Then the blanket dipped in what might have been a nod. "Then I'm Maddie," she said. The way she said it, you could hear it didn't belong to anybody else anymore. "Mornin', Maddie," Hank said, like he'd been saying it years. She breathed once, deeper, reached for the salve Maud had mixed, tallow and sage, and touched it to the brand. The smell rode the warm air, clean and green and animal. "Doesn't erase," she murmured as if repeating a lesson. "Just keeps it from burning." "Plenty," Hank said. "There's 8 in that crooked quiet that makes food taste like it costs something." He set the second cup fresh without calling it out. She took it without looking at him. The small, ordinary taking felt louder than most prayers Hank had heard. By noon the sky had gone to pewter and the snow had crusted just like he said. He shrugged into his coat again. "Checkin' fence," he offered. A thing said to the room so she'd know where he was if she needed the truth of it. He pulled the door to and left that slit the way he always did. The north line lay white and flat, the kind of empty that hides everything. Sage heads pushed through like knuckles. Hank walked the fence where the posts took the wind hardest. He wasn't hunting sign, not at first, but his body had been reading ground since before his hair went gray. A scatter of pitch crumbs, dark as pepper, lay in the drift beside a post where wire had polished the bark. He rolled one grain between thumb and finger, pine, fresh. Then he saw them, 3 sets of hoof prints coming in at a slant from the powder country, heavy where the snow had still been soft, now rimmed with ice. 2 round, clean. The third left a notch on the outside of the track, a little crescent where a chipped nail had bit and torn. He squatted and laid his hand beside it. Big horse, good feed, lazy shoeing or rough country, maybe both. Wind slid a handful of powder across the sign like a gambler's brush. By evening there'd be no prints to argue with. Out here, a man learned what mattered when the ledger got wiped on him regular. Hank stood and looked toward the low hills and the gray seam where powder draw ran like a scar under the snow. He listened without letting the idea show on his face. Nothing spoke back but the north wind and the fence wire humming its one note. He turned for home, the taste of pine pitch still faint on his fingers, the shape of that chipped hoof riding in his head, like a burr he couldn't shake. Maud came back at noon with a loaf that steamed in the cold and a jaw full of weather. She set it down, looked once at the brand on Maddie's wrist, and then looked away on purpose. "Boys who carve letters," she said, "ain't looking for names. They're making property. That's K-Bar 13 work." The way she said it, the stove seemed to cool a notch. Hank told her about the 3 tracks on the north line. "Left hind leaves a crescent," he said, drawing the notch on the table dust with a finger. "Go show Ephraim," Maud said. "He knows a horse the way a preacher knows sin." Hank saddled after dinner while the light still held flat and mean. Maddie stood in the doorway with her blanket around her shoulders, hair tied back with that strip of cloth. The door stayed open without a hand. "I'm going down to the forge," he said to the air between them. "Back before dark." She nodded once. Her eyes slid to the wall where he'd hung the Winchester on low pegs. Grip easy for a small hand. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Seeing it there was its own kind of breath. Ephraim's smithy bled orange into the gray afternoon. The big man stood bare-armed to the wrist, despite the cold, hammer ringing a slow sermon out of a shoe. sparks jumped and died in the snow. "Got a sign I want your eye on," Hank said. He sketched the crescent again on a plank with a nail tip. "Outside edge, left hind. Deep animal, eats well, don't play sure on crust." Ephraim grunted. "That's a hard stepper from the powder. I set a string of nails like that for roughs who run cattle over basalt and don't come back for reset when they ought. Chipped like you say means he's gone a spell without my face. Lazy or drunk or both." He reached to a shelf, pulled down a bent nail with a bright scab of iron near the head. "My pattern. If you find one of these in your yard, you'll know who's been tracking mud across your parlor." "Pitch on a binding, too," Hank said. "Pitch keeps a bad knot from talking," Ephraim said, eyes gone flat. "Holt stink down. You be careful, Crowley. Pay your hay when you can, but don't you owe nobody scream." Hank nodded, the words landing where they needed. By the time he turned home, the day had thinned to tin. The wind changed and came straight out of Powder Draw with a smell like old smoke. Back at the ranch, Maud had gone. The room met him warm. 2 tin cups sat on the table. One held coffee skinned with oil. The other, the second cup, held steam yet. Mattie had set it where he left it earlier, only nearer her reach, like a small piece of ground she'd claimed. He fed the fire and checked the latch. It still took a push before it would lift. He left that sliver of light at the jamb, a promise that cost him nothing and paid plenty. Night put its boot on the roof. Out on the plain the wire sang one long note and then another, as if the posts themselves were listening. Hank set his chair so he could see the door and the window both. Mattie eased down on the braided rug with her back near the jamb, face to the room, eyes steady. She worked the door in a slow lesson. Open a finger, breathe. Close a finger, breathe. The shake in her hands had gone from a full river to a riffle. Sometime after the stove settled and the last light quit the west, the wind brought a thin sound over the crust, glass kissing wood. One clink. Silence spread around it like water, then 2. Hank raised his head. He didn't move otherwise. Mattie's eyes cut to his and held, a question without the danger of words. He went to the window and stood a little aside. The world was a chalk drawing. No lanterns, no riders, just the cotton hush and the fence's low hum. He let his breath go slow so it wouldn't fog the pain to blankness. "From the draw," he said. "Is it them?" Mattie asked, voice small but not the same kind of small as before. "Could be 1,000 things," he said, which out here meant 3. He listened for the third clink that had haunted his thinking since the cottonwood. Drunks going soft at the wrist, care slipping like a boot on ice. It didn't come. The wind shifted and smeared the sound away. He sat again. He oiled the Winchester and set it back on the low pegs. He checked the knife on his belt and left it sheathed. He poured the second cup fresh and nudged it a handspan closer. She took it and didn't spill. When the hour got thin and the fire dropped to red, Hank spread his bedroll on the far boards. He didn't close his eyes. He let the quiet set the hook in him instead. Tracks on the north line, pitch on rawhide, Ephraim's nail, Maud's naming of K-bar 13, the door's crack of light, the second cup, the missing third clink. He owned a few tools in this world: rope, patience, a good horse, a debt or 2, and the sense to keep his mouth shut till it mattered. Some men ride in with guns and noise. Hank Crowley had learned the way of winter. You listen until the ground tells you what to do. Near dawn, when the east was only a thought, he stood and pulled on his coat. He checked the latch once more, left the light where it was, and eased his hat down hard. "Where?" Mattie asked. "Buffalo," he said, "to listen, not to talk." He stepped into the cold, pulled the door to that same finger's width, and let the wind swallow the rest of the answer. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Buffalo huddled under a lid of gray. Smoke from the chimneys sagged instead of rising, pressed flat by the cold. Hank tied off at the rail and let the gelding breathe steam on his sleeve. He stamped his boots and pushed through the bat wings into the saloon where the stove sulked red and the windows wore a coat of breath. He took a corner table with his back to the wall and ordered coffee that tasted like stove scrapings. He didn't talk, he listened. A section hand with cinders ground into his cuffs muttered about two girls gone along the line, one out of Casey, one off a freight stop nearer to Sheridan. A bartender's wife said the Cherokee waitress from the depot had quit without pay, took off in the night. No one asked why the night had rope marks on its hands. Hank filed each word in the ledger he kept behind his eyes. He watched boots, knuckles, how a man's shoulders rose when he lied. The stove popped and the room jumped half an inch, then settled like cattle in a windbreak. A figure slid into the spare chair, like a shadow finding its shape. Nora Two Moons. She wore a coat the color of dusted sage and carried the kind of quiet that doesn't apologize. Her braids were tucked up, hat pulled low, snow sifting off the brim in sugar. She put her gloves on the table and didn't look at him for a long breath. "You smell like pitch," she said finally without turning. "Where pitch doesn't grow." Hank sipped coffee and let the heat burn his tongue into telling him the truth. "North line," he said. "Rawhide cut and hurried." She tilted her head, studying the window where the world blurred. "Draw holes scent," she said. "Powder draw. Wind pools there and forgets what it knows. Men who think they're clever burn pine to drown their stink. Pine just points the way." Hank nodded once. "You charge fair?" "I charge enough to make fools stay home," Nora said. A corner of her mouth twitched. "Ephraim vouches you're not a fool." As if his name brought him, Ephraim Cole shouldered through the bat wings, coat off despite the cold, hammer arms slick with forge oil and winter. He took the next table, set a packet of nails down heavy as a book. "Left hind, outside chip?" he asked, without preface. "Outside chip," Hank said. Ephraim slid one bent nail across the plank between them. "My pattern. If you find one of these where it shouldn't be, don't argue with yourself about coincidence." His eyes moved to Nora. "You take him over there, you keep him from doing anything stupid." Nora didn't blink. "He listens better than most." Ephraim's jaw eased. He leaned in, voice low. "Pay your hay when you can, Hank, and don't you owe anybody's scream." Hank felt the words land where Maud's had. "I hear you," he said. They didn't stay long. Nora bought a twist of tobacco and a short loaf, pocketed both like a woman making a list of things she planned to outlive. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a pewter pan. They walked the length of Front Street without speaking, counting chimneys and the taste of smoke in their teeth. At the livery, Hank checked his cinch and looked down over the north again, toward the low seam of hills that hid the draw's bad temper. "Light's going," he said. "Good," Nora said. "Smoke lies down when the light does. Easier to see the thread it makes." They rode without hurry, cutting sign where the crust let them. About a mile out, Nora lifted two fingers. They slid off the trail and into the shadow of a cut bank. She pointed with her chin against a gray solemnous rock where the wind made a little hollow and forgot itself. A thin stitch of smoke held still as a hair. No other color in the world moved, but that did. "There," she said. Hank let his breath go slow. He read the ground behind his teeth. 3 animals in, none out. The lazy stride of men who trust the distance more than their wits. Somewhere close, a bottle would be finding wood. 1 clink, 2. He could feel it like a pulse he wasn't touching. They watched until their knees went numb. Nora marked exit and entry with her eyes, counted boulders, noted the place where a man could stand and never cast a shadow on a door. Then she turned her horse for home. At the ranch, the first thing Hank saw was the door, latched, but with that same thin seam of light showing, open without a hand. The second thing was the second cup, clean and turned upside down to dry on the table. Maddie stood by the latch with Maud, hair tied back, blanket traded for a man's old shirt and a shawl. Her hands were steadier. "Town?" Maud asked. "Enough of it," Hank said. He reached into his coat and brought out a small knife, plain-handled and honest. He set it on the table between them and eased his hand back, so the knife belonged to the space, not to him. "For doors," he said, meeting Maddie's eyes, and then looking a little off so it wouldn't feel like pressure. "Not for men. Doors you can't make your hands like." Maddie touched the handle with 2 fingers, as if checking temperature. "For doors," she repeated. She worked the latch once, twice, the soft click like breathing with purpose. "Tomorrow we walk a ridge," Nora said from the doorway, snow dusting her shoulders. "We count rocks and fools. We wait on the third clink." Maud snorted. "Bring your legs back in 1 piece and your pride in 2. Hank poured coffee, turned the second cup over and set it near the stove's skirt. He felt the house take a long, low breath. He wasn't a man for speeches. He had a plan instead, made of small tools and smaller distances. Outside, the wind pared the world down to what mattered. Over in the draw, that thread of smoke kept its needle true against the rock. They made their plan the way wintermen make plans. On the far side of supper, with the stove talking soft and no one wasting a word they couldn't spend. Twice. Nora sketched the draw with the butt of a spoon and flour dust on the table. Rock wall here, boulder there, drift like a sleeping bull along the north lip. "They drink early," she said. "First clink at sundown, second when the lies get better, third when hands go rubber. That's our door." Hank nodded. He checked gear that had never lied to him. Winchester, clean, sling-oiled, a short coil of rope, the small pry he used for ice-bolt gates. 2 cartridges laid separate in his pocket like promises. He set them down and picked them up again, just to hear the weight say yes. Maddie watched all this with her back near the jamb, the door still open without a hand, winter threading its thin song through the crack. Her hair was pulled tight with the same strip of cloth. She had traded blanket for shirt and shawl, sleeves rolled once to keep them from catching. The second cup steamed by her elbow. She had poured it herself, and not a drop had jumped. Maud opened her crock of tallow and sage. "Halt," she told Maddie, and the girl put her wrist in the old woman's warm palm. Maud worked salve into the angry edges of K13 with a tenderness that made the stove sound loud. "This don't scrub the past," she murmured. "It just keeps the past from hollerin' when you need to hear something else." Maddie's mouth made a brave line. "What if I hear them?" she asked. "Out there or here?" "You hear your own feet," Maud said, "and the latch." She tapped the door with a knuckle, and it answered with that small, faithful click Maddie had taught back into it. "You been practicin'? Keep on." Nora set a small knife on the table and nudged it with a finger toward Maddie. Hank had named it already. "For doors," Maddie said to herself, touching the handles. "Not for men." Hank wrote by the window where the frost had cleared to a thumbprint oval. "If I don't make it back, find Nora 2 Moons." He folded the paper once, then again, and set it near Maud's salve. His hand stayed on it a beat longer than a note needs. Maddie reached over and took the paper. She tore it clean in 2 and slid 1/2 back to him. The other she tucked down into the inside seam of her shawl. "Then we both carry it," she said, "so somebody brings the message home. Or," her eyes lifted and didn't flinch, "you bring the door home." Hank looked at her without looking hard. The words found a place and sat down. "House rules while we're gone," Maud said, voice going brisk to save her heart. "You keep that crack in the door. You keep the kettle on, but not proud. You put that rifle where we set it. Low, where a small hand can make a big noise if it has to. You don't answer knocks, you answer names. You hear wolves, you let 'em sing. They ain't singing for you." Maddie nodded. "What about the third clink?" "You let it pass you," Nora said. "All our work's riding that rhythm already." They ate a quick pie, heel of bread with broth poured over it till it shone. Hank couldn't taste much beyond iron and habit. He set his cup down. Hers sat beside it, the two little circles of steam lifting together as if they'd agreed to. Wind pawed at the eave. The world outside had the look of a thing being erased. Hank opened the door a wider finger while he laced his boots, then set it back to the exact place it had been. That sliver of light where a person could fix their eyes and measure Maddie's breathing matched it without trying. In, out, door, crack, choice. He shrugged into his coat and shouldered the rifle. Nora cinched her saddle one more hole and checked the rawhide on her reins for telltale pitch. There was none. Maud packed salve, prayer, and a cutting tongue, then decided she'd wait here with Maddie and the iron instead of at her own place with no door cracked to mind. At the threshold, Hank hesitated, which wasn't his way. He touched the jamb with 2 fingers like it was a shoulder he trusted. "If we're not back by—" Maddie shook her head once. "Son doesn't ask questions," she said. "You go when the world says go." He left her a half-smile so small it didn't trouble his face long. "We'll listen for it," he said. The third bottle clink. They rode into a light that didn't belong to any hour, that pewter between when distance flattens and sound travels farther than it should. Snow had a high-crust squeak to it now, the kind that snaps under a misstep and tells on you. The gelding took the grade like an animal who had learned winter's grammar the hard way. On the first ridge, Nora stopped and let the wind write its notes across her cheek. "Hear that?" she asked. Hank listened. The fence wire down valley voiced its one-string hymn. Somewhere a juniper shrugged snow. Farther off, faint as a lie, glass found wood once, a long empty twice. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. They waited for the soft, dull third that says a wrist has turned itself loose. The wind slipped a shoulder and came around from the south with a wet edge in it. Rotten snow smell. Nora's jaw set. "Storm's changing sides," she said. "Tracks are going to die on us." "Then we go now," Hank said. They slid along the ridge's backside and into the shallow reading ground by feel where sight lied. Nora counted boulders and the breadths between them. Ephraim's bent nail rode Hank's pocket like a small truth. The draw opened its mouth below them, rock face sucking wind and sound into a tight curl. There, a thread of smoke held down by cold, betraying where a lamp thought it was safe. They put their horses behind a stand of black brush and went the rest on boots. Hank felt his left knee complain the way old regrets do, quietly and every step. Nora took the lead and then gave it back, letting him own the angle he would have to live with. Snow crust cut at their guns and then softened to powder in the lee. A bottle ticked wood once again and went quiet, like a clock with a mean humor. Behind them, over the flats, the wind rolled itself and came in from a new quarter, shouldering the air so the crust sighed. Hank looked back at the country they had crossed and saw their sign blur, edges going feathery, the ledger page smearing even as the ink dried. He breathed out slow. That was the cliff on a winter job. The ground would testify for you until it didn't, and then the world claimed ignorance with a straight face. He touched Nora's sleeve. She touched the rock with 2 fingers, counting to 3. Their eyes said the rest. Up on the ranch, a kettle sang. A second cup waited where a hand had learned how to pour it. The door stood just the way they'd left it, open by a hair and no more, a promise a house makes to a person learning to stay. Down here, Hank laid his palm on cold stone, felt the hum of wind through it, and listened with all he owned for that soft, careless third clink. The draw held its breath so long the rocks squeaked. Hank felt the cold through the stock into his bones. The bottle tapped wood once, then twice, thin as a gnat on glass. He counted in his head, with Nora's fingers on the stone beside him. When that soft, careless third clink came, dull and late, they moved. Nora slid first, a shadow peeling off shadow. Hank went after. Ephraim last, big and quiet for a big man. The shack leaned into the rock, door hung crooked, a smear of lamplight spilling along the jamb. Smoke climbed and fell, held down by the night like a hand on a throat. Hank didn't knock. He put his boot heel to the latch and kicked. Wood barked. The door flung wide, warm stink and lamp oil hit them in the teeth. A face turned too slow. Hank stepped through and brought the Winchester's butt up hard and clean. Chest, not skull. The man folded around air that wasn't there and sat down hard on his shadow. The one by the table reached for a knife he'd already bragged about. Nora's pistol coughed, and the blade jumped out of his hand. Wrist gone numb, edge ringing on the floor like a bell that didn't belong in any church. He yelped and shut his mouth like the sound had cost him money. A third man went for his Colt. Ephraim didn't waste words or rounds. He booted the gun sideways. It slid 3 feet under a cot where it could think about its life choices. "Easy," Hank said, voice flat. He took 2 steps and smashed the lantern with the rifle stock. Glass went like ice, flame blue, and then turned to nothing, smoke and sparks, lifting and twisting. The room went to a red-black where eyes have to earn what they see. Men who count on light get smaller in the dark. Hank knew that trick and had paid for it before. He let the smoke do honest work. "Hands where the dark can see 'em," Nora said. "Stand on your own names," Ephraim added, which made the hurt one swear by something that wouldn't help him. In the corner, a girl curled small against the wall, knees up, hair in her face. Cherokee, from the look, same as the talk in Buffalo. Hank moved so she saw his feet first, not the rifle. He shrugged out of his wool coat and laid it like a bridge. "Come on, kid," he said, low enough to make the smoke lean toward him to listen. "You breathe with us now." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She slid under the coat like a hand into a mitt. Hank kept one eye on the room and the other on her hands. Rope held them, sticky with something that pulled like sap. He bent without crowding and lifted the end. Pitch, thick and mean, ground into fibers to quiet a knot. He cut through with the short knife he carried for gates and set the rope aside on purpose where the night could remember it. "On your feet," he told the man he'd knocked down. "Slow." The man rose, mouth hard, eyes harder. In the dim, Hank saw the outline of a knife on his belt, the handle carved crude with KC-13. He took it without ceremony and put it on the table with the rope. "You boys write poor," he said. "Letters look better on paper." Nora moved through the room like a seamstress padding pockets for lies. She laid out what she found. 2 cut lengths of rawhide slick with pine pitch, a ticket stub from the rail depot, and a little loop of girl's hair tied in red thread that Hank didn't look at long. Ephraim crouched by the door and fished under the cot with a hook of wire. The Colt came out nose first and weeping dust. Beside it, his big fingers found a small bright thing and pinched it free. He rolled it under his thumb and held it to the little bit of red left in the stove's eye. "Ha," he said, not happy. "Nail outside chip, my pattern, there's your match." He set it with the rope and the knife, like a judge laying papers. "You got no proof," the mouthy one tried. Ephraim tapped the nail with a thick fingernail. "Son, this here's a signature, and I don't sign for swine." Hank cut a strip of sheet off the cot and tied the 3 men in a daisy chain, wrists to belt, room to room. "We're leavin'," he said, "all of a." One of them made a choice he should have made earlier. He dove for the door gap where snow showed like a river of light. He hit Hank with a shoulder and slithered past, splinters chewing his coat. Nora swung and missed clean on purpose. She wasn't a killer by accident. The man went into the night, boots grinding crust. One hand pressed to the edge where Nora's bullet had kissed him earlier. A thin line of blood wrote itself across the snow and ran for the rocks. "Let him have the dark," Nora said, breathing steady. "Law likes a runner with his own red string. We take what we can carry," Hank said. He scooped the K-13 knife, the pitch-sticky ties, the bent nail, and the ticket stub into a grain sack. He lifted the coat tighter around the girl's shoulders and felt her ribs count under his palm through wool. "You good to walk?" he asked her. She nodded, once, twice, small moves that meant yes in a language the room could understand. He put her between him and Ephraim and let Nora ride the rear, pistol lazy but not asleep. They stepped into weather that had sharpened while they argued. Snow needled the skin and made every edge honest. Behind them the shack wheezed smoke and regret. Ahead the draw held its old breath again. Halfway to the horses the wind turned and brought a sound thin as old tin, far off, riding the flats. A train whistle, long and lonesome, pulled across the night like thread through a wound. The runner would think of that track the way a thirsty man thinks of shade. He'd aim for it. Maybe Law would catch him where men counted cars and not hoofprints. "Depot," Ephraim said. "Law," Hank answered. They got the girl in the saddle with more wool than grace and started her moving. The sack of proof thumped against Hank's hip. It felt like a promise he hadn't wanted but had taken anyway. At the ridge they looked back once. The shack was a darker dark against the rock, the hole where the lantern had been burned like a bad thought. Hank and Nora stood a long second with the cold, burning their eyes clear, and then they turned for home where a door would be standing open without a hand, and a second cup would be waiting to be poured hot and full. They hit town with night still in their coats. The girl rode small under Hank's wool, jaw set like she was holding her teeth in. The sheriff's office sat crooked to the street, windows yellowed with old tobacco, and a calendar 2 months wrong. Sheriff Dugan looked up slow, a man who'd learned to let storms spend themselves before he moved a chair. "We don't do midnight," he said. Hank set a grain sack on the desk and spilled the draw onto wood. K-13 knife, rawhide ties slick with pitch, a bent nail with its outside chip, and a ticket stub off the depot board. Ephraim leaned in and tapped the nail with a soot-black thumb. "My pattern," he said. "From the powder. I don't sign for swine." Nora laid a sheet of butcher paper flat and drew the exact bearings. Rock face, drift, the seam where smoke stitched itself to stone. Her pencil cut cold and true. "You'll find 2 beds and 1 lantern dead," she said, "and the floor will smell like pine where pine doesn't grow." The girl, Cherokee, cheeks chapped raw, stood with her back near the door, hands held like she wasn't ready to own them yet. When Dugan finally met her eyes, she gave him what she had. A voice, small but not broken. "They kept me because they could," she said. "One had a bad left shoe, one carved letters." Dugan's jaw worked. He looked at the desk, not because he didn't see, but because he did. "You bringin' me trouble," he said to Hank, "or bringin' me proof?" "Both," Hank said. "Enough of the second to make the first worth your badge." The sheriff rubbed the nail between finger and thumb, felt the chip bite his skin, and sighed like a man getting off a warm chair. He pushed back, reached for the telegraph on the far table, and rattled off a wire the way an old hand wraps a bandage. No poetry, all purpose. Warrants started their slow birth down the line. Depot, he said to his deputy. Now. They took the girl next. The sisters kept a room for strays behind the chapel, whitewashed walls that made you forget how winter chews bone. A nun with hands like bread took the weight of her and the coat both. "We can make quiet," she said. The girl looked at Hank, then at the floor, then at the cracked statue of Mary by the window. "Will they come back?" she asked, not moving her mouth much. "If they do," Hank said, "they find the door shut." Back at the office, a boy with a deputy's star and snow in his eyebrows burst through the door, breathing like a dog that had outrun its sense. "Caught two at the depot," he managed. "One with a fresh rap on his wrist and another buying tickets with somebody else's money." He slapped down a pair of iron cuffs for punctuation. "They didn't argue long." Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Dugan nodded once, as if gravity had finally remembered its job. "Send a wagon to the draw and fetch what's left," he told another man. To Hank, "Law got here late, but it's here." "It'll do," Hank said. Through it all, Nora watched the map she'd drawn like a mother watches a child that's learned to stand. Ephraim set the bent nail dead center on the sheriff's blotter, a black dot in a white world. "Don't lose that," he said. "It's a better witness than most men." They walked out into a sky the color of burnt tin. The east had a seam of pale in it, not sunrise so much as the idea of one. Freight wagons clinked down Front Street. Somewhere out on the flats a train blew, long and low, the kind of sound you feel in your ribs. Dugan's runner came back an hour later with news from a ranch south of town. A single rider slipping the willow bottoms with a coat torn at the sleeve, heading toward country where law goes thin. Nora looked at Hank. Ephraim didn't say a word. Hank turned the thought over and put it down. "Let him ride," he said. "I got my hands full of what's mine." They stopped at the sisters again. The girl had a blanket that wasn't gray and a cup that wasn't dented. She held both like they might vanish if she blinked. "You'll be all right," Maud would have said, if she were. Hank only touched his hat brim and let the door shut quiet behind him. By the time they hit the north road, daylight had made up its mind. Snow gave back a little glitter. The wind still had teeth, but it wasn't mean for sport anymore. When the ranch came up out of the white, the first thing Hank looked for was the door. It sat just so, latched loose, a hair of light where a person could fix their breath. The second thing he saw was the second cup, washed and set upside down to dry, a small gleaming hill by the stove. Mattie stood by the latch, shawl tight, hair tied with that strip of cloth. Maud had a look that said she'd argued with worry and won the first round. Mattie's eyes went to Nora, to Ephraim, to Hank last. The question in them was simple. Are we still us? "We're here," Hank said. "Law?" Maud asked. "Late but enough," Hank said. He set the sack of empty proof on the table because the desk downtown had taken the weight of it now. He took off his gloves slow, laid them side by side, and poured coffee in 2 tin cups, because habit does what sermons can't. Steam lifted the same as it had that morning, only steadier. Out past the fence the wind changed its line again and came from the south, smelling bare and strange. Somewhere down there a rider lowered his head against a world that would take him for a while and then forget his name. Hank let that trail go the way a man lets a bad thought pass. There was a door to mind and a second cup to keep full, and sometimes that is how justice gets done where the badge can't walk every mile. Cold softened around the edges. Enough that morning light came through the window, like skimmed milk, instead of iron. The stove ticked to itself, pleased with the kind of heat a man could keep. Hank set out 2 tin cups, the same as always. His at the table's scarred corner, the second by the stove's skirt, where steam could do its quiet work. He didn't think about it. His hands had learned. Maddie beat him to the kettle. She lifted it with 2 hands and poured, careful, steady. Not a drop jumped. The salve, tallow, and sage sat open on the table, and the angry shine on K13 had gone to a sullen brown. She dabbed it once, then twisted her hair back with that strip of cloth and tied a knot that would hold it through chores. They made a list with their bodies. Hank hauled in a slab of ice from the trough, cracked it with the back of an axe, and fed the shards to the water barrel where they could melt honest. Maddie shook out blankets, beat dust into the door crack where Wee Win could steal it, then set boots in a line by the jamb, her small pair next to his bigger ones, toes pointing true. She opened the door and closed it again, the latch giving that clean little answer it had learned, open without a hand. She smiled, brief and dry, as if at a child that had finally minded. Nora came at noon with the kind of sun that lies about warmth. They walked the south pasture, and she taught Maddie the grammar of sign, how a drift holds a story and a tuft of grass tells the wind's last 2 minds. They set wind traps, little fans of willow that catch direction and keep it, a poor man's compass that never needed polishing. Maddie crouched, felt the breeze change, and placed her trap in the curl of it, with a care that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with knowing. "Read that," Nora said. Maddie squinted. "South going lazy," she said, "like a drunk taking the long way home." Nora's mouth tugged sideways. "You'll do." Back at the barn, the chipped hoof got a once-over from Hank until Ephraim could come with his irons. The gelding stood patient, hip-cocked, breath smoking up into the rafters. Maddie ran the brush down his shoulder and along his ribs. The gelding flinched once, then leaned into it like a man leaning into a wall that would hold. "Good," Hank said, and meant the horse and the hand both. Maud brought a loaf and 3 opinions that turned out to be right. She watched Maddie move and nodded to herself. "Dora's teaching you," she said. "That's a better school than most." They ate heel bread and soup, thickened by habit. Maddie poured the 2nd cup for Hank without looking at him, set it where his hand would find it, and poured her own after. Steam rose in 2 straight lines. The small, ordinary sound of cups on wood made the room feel full, in a way talking never had. When the light went thin, Hank fixed a hinge on the back gate that had squealed like a bad conscience for a month. Maddie held the board steady and didn't try to help, more than asked. When he was done, she studied his face the way a person checks weather. "You got quiet?" she said. "I stay that way," he said. "Quieter," she said, and he let that spun because it was true. He wiped his hands on a rag that would never be clean and looked past her shoulder to the hills that had kept secrets longer than any man. Words had been stacking in him since the cottonwood. He set them down slow, one at a time, like rifles on a church step. "The day my wife took sick," he said, "I chased a bunch of steers that didn't want to cross a frozen creek. Figured money fixes doctoring. Figured stubborn fixes everything else. By the time I come back with mud up my legs and a story I thought was worth telling, she was gone. Whole room smelled like soap and lemon peel and a mistake I can't put down." Maddie stood still as a fence post. Wind slipped through the door's crack and made a line on the floor. She watched that line while she answered set. "You came back right this time," she said. Not soft, not hard. True. He felt it land in the empty place where heat doesn't reach and sit there warming what it could. Night rolled up clean. They kept the stove honest and put the house to rights by touch. Maddie slept across the hall, door propped with a boot heel, her shadow long in the crack, his longer in the opposite. Somewhere between the rooms a kind of peace went walking, like a hand that knows how to knock and how to wait. In the mornings after that, the list got longer and easier. Maddie greased harness leather till it went from wood to skin. She set the latch and stepped away without checking it again, a better victory than most men brag about. She learned the querulous language of the chicken coop and the straight talk of plug tobacco drying on a string. She laughed once, a quick dry thing that left her startled at herself and pleased. Maud looked at Hank over her spectacles and let him see that she'd seen it. He pretended not to and failed. From town, the sheriff sent word. 2 of the drawmen had spilled their pockets and some of their guts. The 3rd had slipped south where the map thins and names go missing. Hank read the note and folded it back the way it came. He didn't feed it to the fire. He set it under a cup to keep the table from wobbling, and let it do that job instead. In the yard, Ephraim finally came and set the gelding's foot on his knee, rasp whispering, nail heads shining like coins sunk true. "That'll carry you on good ground and bad," he said, giving the fetlock a last rub. He watched Maddie walk, saw her shoulders set level, and grunted a little thing that stood in for a compliment. Days stretched. The brand on her wrist went from shout to whisper under salve. She stopped counting her breaths at the door and started counting fence posts from the ridge, because she liked to know exactly how far a man could see a home from. Hank oiled the Winchester, hung it low, and forgot to be surprised when he found it later with a clean patch draped over the sight, someone else minding what mattered. That evening the sky went the color of old pewter again. They took their cups out to the porch and sat in a silence that wasn't empty. Far off, a train whistle unrolled across the flats, long and low, a reminder that the old world was still moving its pieces whether they watched or not. Maddie listened, eyes on the strip of light at the door. "Think he's on it?" she asked. "Maybe," Hank said. "Maybe the sound just likes to brag." She nodded once. They watched their breaths smoke and tangle and go thin. Hank lifted his cup. Maddie matched him. 2 little circles of steam rose in the cold and held together longer than you'd guess. Inside, the door kept its promise, open without a hand, a small line of light you could live by. The kind of justice that doesn't carry a badge, but keeps showing up at the same hour, pouring the second cup, putting tools back where they belong, and teaching hurt hands to hold ordinary things without shaking. Thaw came in inches, not miles, the kind that shows up first as a drip off the eave and a darker line under the fence where snow lets go. Hank woke to that music and the smell of wet dust, thinking about nothing and nobody, which is its own kind of grace. A boy from town rode up late morning with a note folded small as a coin. Sheriff Dugan's hand didn't waste ink. 2 confessed, 1 slipped south. The boy waited like he might be paid in news. Hank gave him heel bread and sent him on. He read the page twice, then set it under the table leg that wobbled. The table steadied. That was work enough for a piece of paper. Ephraim came with his irons and his rasp, steam walking off his beard. He set the gelding's hoof on his knee, eyes half closed like he was listening to a hymn only he could hear. Rasp whispered, clinches rang soft, hoof oil lifted a sweet animal note. "Chip no mourn," he said, patting the fetlock. "He'll hold you on good ground and bad." "Same to you," Hank said. Nora turned up next, shoulders powdered with thaw snow that didn't know whether it wanted to be water. She drew the high trails in soot on the barn door, switchbacks where the world pinches, a spring on the lee side that keeps its mouth shut. "When this crust gives," she told Maddie, "we'll walk here slow. Rocks don't forgive hurry." Maddie traced the line with a finger, then wiped it clean so it wouldn't sit there telling strangers where to go. Her wrist showed, salve sunk in, K-13 gone from shout to downturned murmur. She tied a fresh strip of cloth round it, not to hide it, but to keep it from owning the day. They all ate standing, bowls hot in their hands. Maud arrived late with a pie nobody deserved, and the last word nobody asked for. She looked around the room the way a woman does when she's checking for leaks, and found none. Her eyes landed on the stove and then passed it by. "A house keeps warm because of people, not the stove," she said, like it was a law she hadn't voted for, but obeyed anyway. After they'd gone, Quiet came back and sat down. Hank fixed a strap on the sled he might not need again till next year, and then put it away like a man who believes in next year. Maddie took the broom to the threshold, worked the bristles right up to the crack, and left that hair of light just so, open without a hand. She poured coffee without looking at her own doing and set the second cup at his elbow, steam rising even. He tried to thank her and found that the act already had. They carried their cups out to the porch and let their backs find wood. Snowfields threw light in a way that made your eyes on it. Far off, a train called itself across the flats and then took it back. Maddie listened without ducking. "You still not going after him?" she asked, not making it a dare. "I'm not," Hank said. "Man can chase his shadow till he doesn't know which one is which. I got land to keep. I got a door to mind." He tipped his head toward that thin strip of brightness in the jam. "Some things run better when you leave 'em be." She weighed with that and found it fit. "You chose mercy," she said, and then, after a breath, "for you. Maybe that's the only kind a man gets to choose." The sun slid a finger down the pasture, and the fence wire hummed its one low note for nobody in particular. Hank went to the barn and came back with a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table and opened it like he wasn't sure it should be opened. Inside lay a comb with half its teeth and a woman's mirror clouded at the edges. His wife's things he hadn't had the stomach to throw or the courage to keep in the open. "These belong where work gets done," he said, "if you want 'em." Maddie turned the mirror so it caught a door light instead of faces. She set it on a nail by the latch where it threw a pale square onto the floor. "Good," she said, "then the door can see itself." They laughed a little, the kind that doesn't carry far. Hank felt something ease in his ribs that hadn't since lemon peel and soap, and a mistake he'd been carrying like bad debt. He didn't name it. Naming can scare a tender thing off. Evening thinned the world to shapes and habits. He checked the back gate. It swung without squeal. She checked the latch. It pushed, then lifted like it had been taught. He hung the Winchester on the low pegs and found a clean patch folded over the site where someone else's care had slept. The stove ticked, the roof talked, the house did the rest. Before they turned in, Maddie worked the door open a finger, close a finger, not counting now, just doing, and then left it where it had been all along. She touched the strip of cloth on her wrist and didn't flinch. "Not love," she said, not asking and not warning. "No," Hank said. He looked at the two cups, cooling on the table side by side like they'd been set there by a rule older than either of them. "But it's warm enough." They stood there a while, breathing the same pace, watching the horse in the corral blow smoke like a train that knew when to keep quiet. The mirror caught a last coin of sun and let it go. Somewhere down south, a rider started to believe the country would forget his name. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. Here the ledger read simple: a door that stayed open by a hair, a cup that got filled twice, a brand that went to whisper and would one day go to nothing. Justice, when it bothered to stop by, came through the back, nodded at the work, and left the place warmer than it found it. Snow will melt by inches. The door will keep its hair of light. 2 cups will steam most mornings, and the brand will fade to a rumor. If this sat with you a spell, drop a 0 in the comments, or a 1 if you'd have kept writing. Tap subscribe and stick around the fire. I've got more trails to walk with you, more quiet kinds of justice to show.